Greetings, fellow readers and story lovers, and welcome back to my channel. This video is going to be the fourth and final installment of my Sapphic book review series for June. I'm a little sad to see this video series go. I had a lot of fun reading these books and also making these videos, so maybe I'll do it again next year. But for now, the book in question is Nothing Sung and Nothing Spoken by Nita Tyndall, an American author, I believe situated in North Carolina. But the story is set in World War II Berlin. This is kind of like why I picked up this book, because I thought it was very interesting for an American author to write a story set in both another country and another time period. And also, this is a time period I do know a fair few things about, because this subject is one that we discuss actually very heavily in school. At least when I went to school, this was kind of like all my school years, at least once a year, the subject of the Second World War would be brought up. So I know a fair bit about the time period, and I was very interested to see, how an American author would portray that. So let's start with the review. Again, as has been the case for all previous three reviews, this review will contain spoilers. So if you haven't read the book and you don't want any spoilers, I don't believe this review is for you. But I will try to keep it relatively light in the beginning, and I will give spoiler warnings as we go through. But let's start with the general premise. So, like I said, this is a historical fiction set in World War II Berlin. It is a Sapphic coming of age story, and also within that, there is this kind of swing Jugend World War II resistance story, which is tied to the historical setting, obviously. The main story begins in 1938 Berlin, so just before the start of World War II. Both the prologue and epilogue of this book are set in post World War II Berlin, so in 1945, I believe in August, if I remember correctly. And this gives the story an immediate reflective, memory based vibe. So I immediately got the sense that the narrator was talking about events in retrospect. It's a first person narrative, which is the only one of the four books that has a first person narrative. All the others had a third person narrator or a dual POV. But this is a first person narrator called Charlotte, mostly called Charlie by the others, sometimes Lottchen by her mother, which is a very German nickname for Charlotte. At the beginning of the story, she is 15, as you can imagine, because the story starts in 1938 and then moves through the war years. She is supposed to get older in the course of the story, but she kind of like read to me as the same age from start to finish. So when at the beginning of the story she was supposed to be 15, I kind of had like a little bit of trouble keeping track of her age or remembering that she was 15, because she read so much older. Charlie is a part of a group of friends who are all interested in swing music. And in case this isn't widely known, swing music and pretty much everything from outside of Germany was banned in the Third Reich. So swing music was very, very much forbidden during that time period. And so swing music is very much a symbol in this novel, and it becomes sort of like a stand in for freedom, for rebellion, for youth culture, and for forbidden identity, because also being queer was not allowed in the Third Reich. Again, I don't know how widely this is known, but gay people and queer people were very much put into concentration camps. And not so fun fact, they were designated by a pink triangle, and all of those designated with a pink triangle were not set free by the Allies, because in that time period, being gay and being queer was also considered a crime by the Allied forces. Also, one of the other main storylines is obviously this coming of age thread. So Charlie is at the beginning of the novel is already very much in love with Geli, and she may not fully understand it or admit it at first. Like, she may not fully understand what she's feeling for her friend, but especially from the reader's perspective, her yearning is pretty much obvious from page one. So, now that we all know what the general premise of this book is, let's talk a little bit about the historical setting and the theme of resistance, because obviously this is going to be like a very large part of this book. I mean, it's a World War II story that is centered around forbidden music, and obviously, like I said, this becomes a symbol of resistance. The first thing I noted here is that it is set in Berlin instead of Hamburg. And like the swing Jugend was a very, very real thing that existed in pre World War II and World War II Germany, but they were mostly based in Hamburg because Hamburg had a port, and that is where they could get international shipments of records. Because how would you listen to swing music if you don't have access to those records? So that was kind of like the first thing that I noticed, and I started wondering, okay, but why? Why is it set in Berlin and not in Hamburg? And I mean, I could come up with like a few possible reasons. I mean, Berlin is more internationally recognizable. I think a lot of people, internationally speaking, a lot more people have heard of Berlin instead of Hamburg. But also, as the story goes on, I mean, the whole war setting becomes much more apparent. So having it set in Berlin makes it possible to for the story to intersect with like Nazi power and the proceedings of the war, the bombings, and also later occupation. Because again, I don't know how widely known this is, but the whole of Germany was split among the four Allied forces: America, England, UK, France, and the Soviet Union. And they all basically got apart. And Berlin was a city that was split into four parts, actually. So that's why the Berlin Wall is called that, because it ran directly through Berlin, separating East and West Germany, but that's after the war. So Berlin became a much more convenient setting, I would say, for the story to take place. But Hamburg still becomes relevant later on through another character, and they do tie the whole swing Jugend to Hamburg, like, oh, kind of like our cousins over in Hamburg. And the next thing I noticed is the author clearly put a ton of research into the period. So there were a lot of historical facts that I noticed were included. For example, Hitler's birthday, which was a holiday in that time. Then we have the Bund Deutscher Mädel, the BDM, which was this youth group of girls where you were required to be a member of. And also like the Hitler Jugend, the HJ, which was the equivalent of the Bund Deutscher Mädel, but for boys. There were several historical events that were mentioned and featured in the story. For example, Reichspogromnacht, the November pogroms, where basically like the hatred and discrimination for Jews really ramped up. Also, the start of the Second World War obviously played a major role in the plot of the story. The whole thing with the forbidden jazz and swing music, again, I already noted that this was very much a real thing. It's hard or difficult to call swing Jugend a resistance group. I mean, they were kind of resisting in a small way, but especially after the war, they faced a lot of criticism for being pretty much apolitical, kind of like, we just want to listen to music. But when you're listening to forbidden music, isn't that kind of a form of resistance also? And then when the war starts, we have air raids, and they have to shelter in the cellars or in the U-Bahn station. So that was all very realistic. And then towards the end, you get this incredibly impactful scene of a public punishment, which Nazi officers and SS officers very much did. And then in the epilogue, you get the Soviet invasion, which also obviously is a real life event that happened at the end of World War II. So, as someone who is familiar with German World War II history, this setting felt very realistic. So, props to the author for doing all of this research to believably set the story in World War II Germany. A theme of this book is small acts of resistance. So they're listening to forbidden music, they're going to dance halls, so they're kind of like sneaking out at night to do that. In order to, or when they are in these dance halls, they choose English or American names. So Charlotte becomes Peggy, or they meet another boy who is kind of like almost consistently referred to as Tommy, but then it turns out his real name is Moritz. So they all choose these American names as also a little bit of a form of resistance. Later on, Charlie and Renate start sneaking postcards with anti-party sentiments into people's mailboxes. And this may sound really small, like, oh, what good is that going to do? But in a totalitarian regime, this was very dangerous for them. And then Greta, Charlie's younger sister, later becomes really interesting because of the way that she wants to resist while kind of staying within the system. I will go into more detail about that when I'm in the more spoilery sections, but this was a very good example of small acts of resistance. And then I noticed there was kind of like a sentence that was repeated several times throughout the book, where the narrator, so Charlie, says that I look away. But pretty much every time something terrible or uncomfortable happens. So the first instance I noticed this with was there was in the pre-World War II timeline, there was a Jewish man that was forcefully removed from a restaurant by SS officers, and Charlie looks away from that and doesn't want to look at what's going on there. Like, you understand why she's doing this. Is kind of, it's fear, it's self-protection, is this feeling of helplessness of what can I do. But obviously it's set up for some really good and strong character development. So I clocked that early of like, oh, I think I know where this is going, and then it did lead somewhere, and I was very glad that it did. So now that we know the general premise and have an idea of the setting and the historical nature of the setting, let's talk about characters. And this is kind of like where I will go into like mid-tier spoilers. I'm not going to fully spoil the ending just yet, but I am going to talk about certain plot points. So this is kind of like where I feel like if you want to read this book without any preconceived notion of what's going to happen, here's where I would tap out of this review. So yeah, so like I said, let's talk about characters. So Charlie first, obviously, she's the first person narrator. She is 15 at the beginning, but very much reads older, and then also throughout the course of the story gets older. She chooses the name Peggy for these dance hall night outs, and this kind of like becomes representative of a freer swing identity. So Charlie is the respectable German girl that she is expected to be. There's also this kind of through line of Kinderküche Kirche, which translates to children, church, and cooking, which was kind of like the expected norm for women in the Third Reich. That's kind of like what they were supposed to be. They were supposed to be housewives, they were supposed to have children, and they were supposed to stay in the kitchen and cook. And then Peggy becomes her freer, more rebellious, more American coded self. And I very much feel like by the end, these two kind of merge. So at the beginning, it's very much like, oh, Charlie is the one who does what she's supposed to, and Peggy is the one who is more free and more rebellious. But by the end, like I said, the two very much kind of like become the same person. And like I said, it becomes pretty obvious from the very beginning that she is in love with her friend Geli. She follows Geli's lead early on. There's actually like a quote on page 10 that reads, I do what I always do. I let her lead and I follow. This was like a very interesting relationship dynamic that was being set up. Like, I very much like, oh, I feel like this could become maybe a little bit toxic. I wonder if Charlie is going to develop away from that and become her own person or stand up for herself a little bit more. And yes, she does. She very much does. So she goes pretty much from following Geli to resisting in her own right. So like, actually, I didn't mention this, but Geli takes her to her first dance hall. So that's how Charlie learns about these things. So it's kind of like she follows Geli to these events, and she only goes because Geli goes. But then this becomes very much a resisting in her own right, and she wants to do more against this regime. To at the very end, she chooses Greta, her sister, over Geli. This is a little bit of a spoiler towards the end, but I will go into more detail about this later on. And in the end, she forces herself to look at something very uncomfortable. Again, I will go into more detail in the later spoiler sections. So you can see this very clear character trajectory of she starts out being like very much a follower, very much in Geli's shadow, pretty much, to becoming a person in her own right and standing up for her own beliefs. So the next character we obviously need to talk about is Geli, or Angelika. She is an SS officer's daughter. So her father is very much not just a member of the party, he is an SS officer. He very much believed in these Nazi ideals. But it also means that she is wealthier and more privileged than Charlie and the others. The others all go to a Realschule, which is, how do I explain this most succinctly? So our secondary school is split into three distinct forms: Hauptschule, Realschule, and Gymnasium. And Realschule is where you leave with, they call it mittlere Reife. The equivalent in the UK would be GCSEs. It's kind of like the standard Schulabschluss. Missing the English word here. It's like the standard degree you leave secondary school with. And then a gymnasium is where you get your A levels, which allows you to go to university. So you can only go to university if you have A levels, and you can only get those A levels at a gymnasium. You can also get them at a Gesamtschule, which is kind of like the German equivalent of a high school where everyone can go to and you can get every degree. So from Hauptschule, Realschule, and Gymnasium, depending on your grades. So that's kind of like why it's an important distinction that Geli goes to a gymnasium so she can get her Abitur, whereas the others cannot. Also, like her father being an SS officer means that her family has more protection as long as they stay within the party line. And this becomes also like relevant because there is kind of like this gap between Charlie and Geli, where because Geli has this privilege, she can shelter in better bomb shelters. She has this better access to education. But Geli often seems kind of unaware of danger. So very early on, she says to Charlie, "It's just dancing, but it's dancing to forbidden music." And she kind of like doesn't see how that could potentially be dangerous. We later on learn that she more chooses to ignore it. So she does know what her father is doing, and she does know that, the party ideals aren't necessarily ideals for everyone, but she kind of like chooses to not deal with it. And it's largely out of self protection, but this was kind of like the early sign where I'm like, I'm gonna get frustrated with this character, aren't I? She can be very selfish. She hosts a Tanztee with the Swingjugend at her house, and there are some friends from her gymnasium that very much make fun of Charlie for being a seamstress. So at this point, she already has her mittlere Reife. She can't get an apprenticeship, so she takes a job at a factory sewing clothes. And they very much make fun of her, like, "Oh, you're just a little seamstress." And Geli just doesn't stand up for her. And at the very end, it becomes very apparent that she very much expected Charlie to remain constantly emotionally available for her. Like, it doesn't matter how distant they grow, it doesn't matter how much Geli pulls away from Charlie. Charlie is supposed to just stay where she is, and then Geli can come back to her whenever she feels like it. So yeah, that, like I said, it was a very interesting dynamic between those two. But also at the same time, Geli has kind of like a hidden thoughtful side. She reads Heine, which is or who was a Jewish German poet, so his poetry was very much forbidden during the Nazi regime. But she still has a book of his poems that she gives to Charlie and tells her to memorize a poem from this, her favorite poem out of the book. Overall, I don't think Charlie is a badly written character. I actually think she's a very well written character, but she is written to be frustrating. Like I said, with her privilege and her sometimes cluelessness, which turns out to not be cluelessness, but willful cluelessness. Like she kind of like shuts her eyes deliberately from what's going on because she'd rather not deal with it. So, and that became very frustrating. Over the course of the novel, it turned my frustration with her character into frustration with the romance, which is not ideal for a romance novel. Third friend of the group is Renate. She is initially interested in Minna, but that doesn't really go anywhere, mostly because Minna has to leave the country, although there is a line later on where she says that Minna just wasn't interested in her. She is almost deaf in one ear, but has to hide it because disabilities weren't allowed during the Nazi regime. Like there was very much stigma among disabilities and disabled people, and she would have been excluded from for example the BDM, the Bund Deutscher Mädel, if they had ever found out that she was deaf in one ear. And kind of like her disability shows just one more way that Nazi ideology harms people who don't fit into its ideal through no fault of their own, really. Her family's relationship to the party is kind of complicated. So at the beginning, it very much seems like her mother buys into some of the party rhetoric. For example, like jazz music is called degenerate, and she then also calls, when they play a jazz record, she also then calls this music degenerate. So it seems like she does believe some of the party ideology, but then Renate's younger brother, Fritz, becomes increasingly radicalized throughout the story. So even before he enters the Hitlerjugend proper, you get very much the sense that he believes in this, he believes in the war, he believes in the Führer, he believes in this whole party ideology. And when the more and more extreme this gets, Renate's and Fritz's parents seem very much appalled by this radicalization. When Minna leaves the country after Reichspogromnacht in order to protect herself, and Charlie and Geli grow more and more apart as the war years goes on, Renate and Charlie grow increasingly closer and eventually form a romantic connection, which felt slightly sudden to me at first, but eventually Renate very much seemed like the healthier choice for Charlie. Like I mentioned, there's this kind of like toxic dynamic going on with Charlie and Geli. So once Renate became the romantic interest, I very much could see like, yeah, no, I think they could work. They seem cute together. And there was a really touching scene right when this started to become more of a romantic connection, where Renate lists some of Charlie's qualities that she really likes. And there's one line of like, you care so much that it hurts you sometimes. So it very much feels like Renate sees Charlie and sees her goodness and her character and likes and loves her for who she is. And it very much becomes a they stand side by side instead of Charlie is in Geli's shadow, so they seem more equal. And so like Renate very much feels like much more emotionally stable than Geli, and that led me to think that Renate and Charlie are a much more long-term couple. But Geli remains a constant presence in the book, and Charlie obviously remains emotionally entangled with her. So it kind of made it a little bit hard to root for them. Like I said, I could very much see that they are the healthier couple, that Renate is the healthier choice for Charlie, but Geli is very much still present and in Charlie's mind. Minna, like I said, is the Jewish friend of the group. She wants to become a nurse, but knows that she can't due to being Jewish, so she will not get accepted into nursing school. Her being Jewish is very much relevant to the plot, and gives it sort of personal stakes. Like now you know this character who's very directly affected by the Nazi regime and by the anti-Jewish sentiment that was very much prevalent in the Third Reich. So her family is being watched, spied on by the Hausmeister in their building. She has to leave the country after Reichspogromnacht. And also her story, or what happens to her after she leaves, never gets completely resolved. So you know that that her and her family go to Paris, and she sends Renate a postcard that they have arrived safely, but then you pretty much never hear from her again, and you don't know if she has survived the Second World War, because Paris would have also been invaded by the Nazis, so it's very uncertain if she survived. Let's talk a little bit more about some of the side characters. So I already mentioned Greta, Charlie's younger sister. They have a very cute sibling dynamic. Charlie wants to protect Greta. Like, she keeps her very much away from all of the resistance stuff that she's doing, which Greta grows increasingly frustrated with. Towards the tail end of the book, she calls Charlie out on this. Like, you never trust me. You don't think I'm capable of doing this when I am capable of doing this. And it's consistently noted that she kind of grows up the most and changes the most. But Charlie's perception of her as her younger sister, as this young child that needs protecting, doesn't change until Greta calls her out on this. And throughout the novel, it initially seems like she is going to be influenced by the JM, the Jungmädel, which is kind of like the precursor to the Bund Deutscher Mädel. And so initially, it seems like she's being influenced by the leader in her JM group. But, like I hinted at earlier, later it is revealed that she very much intends to resist in her own way. So she herself becomes a leader. So when she joins the BDM, she becomes a leader for another Jungmädel group. And she then admits to her sister that she intends to not pass on party ideology to the girls in her group the way that she is supposed to. And that's how she intends to resist. Which, again, like another small act of resistance that doesn't necessarily seem like it's going to be much, but it is there. So another character that I've mentioned already is Fritz, who is Renate's younger brother, and he gets very much radicalized throughout the course of the story. I mean, it's already hinted at towards the beginning that he is kind of like sympathetic towards the Nazi ideology, but he very much gets radicalized by his surroundings, really. So initially, he's not even in the Hitlerjugend because he's too young, but there are some neighbor boys who move into the flat that Minna and her family vacate. And he kind of like starts hanging around them and starts getting influenced by them. And I thought that his character was just a very fascinating portrayal of how youth can be shaped by the system and how the system just kind of worked as intended. Like, the reason that the BDM and the Hayot existed was very much centralization of the populace. So that's what Hitler wanted. He wanted everyone to think the same. So, and that's also why everyone had to be in the BDM and in the Hayot, because you were only supposed to learn party approved things. You were only supposed to get your knowledge from these centralized groups that you had to be a part of. So it was very much the system working as intended during those times. He also has a role in the climax of the story, which I, again, will get to in more detail when I talk about that. But his role in this climax kind of like makes the danger of indoctrination feel very, very personal. So I thought his character, again, was this fascinating portrayal of the indoctrination of youth, and added these personal stakes. So his character was very interesting to me. So now that we've talked about the characters, let's talk a little bit about the romance and relationship dynamics that develop throughout the course of the story. This is also where the major spoilers start to come up. So again, if you haven't read the book, I would suggest that you probably stop watching here and skip to the ending. So let's start with Charlie and Geli. Like I said, Charlie yearns for Geli very early on, and continues throughout the first half of the book. It was almost too heavily signposted for my liking. Like, I think I was basically not even 3 chapters in when I was kind of like, I get the hint. Yeah, she's into her. Can we maybe tone it down a little bit? But Geli's feelings remain unclear for a very long while. So throughout most of the book, I was kind of, or most of the first half of the book, I was kind of like, oh, is she straight? Is this a story of the main character falling for a straight girl? Is she maybe bisexual? Is she just in denial about her feelings? So she hooks up with one boy and then she gets into a relationship with another boy, and that kind of made me think like, oh, is this comphet, so compulsory heteronormativity? Like, is she just feeling like she's supposed to get with boys because that's what's expected of her? So like the book had me wondering for a good while if Charlie was falling for a straight girl here. And this was also like, this was the very first thing that made it very hard for me to root for their relationship, apart from the like slightly toxic dynamic that was going on between them. Like, you cannot root for a queer girl falling for a straight girl because that's never going to have a happy ending, is it? But then there's a whole situation with another girl, Ingrid, that Charlie kisses in order to make Geli jealous, and this works a charm. And they kiss, and so then it becomes clear that Geli very much does have feelings for Charlie. So obviously she is not just simply straight, though it is never actually clarified what she is. And by the end, she's still in a relationship with a boy. So maybe bisexual, maybe compulsory heterosexuality, who knows? And like I said, so very early on, I already found their relationship hard to root for, and that just kind of continued throughout the book. So Geli is very privileged. Geli constantly pulls away from Charlie. Geli almost never stands up for Charlie. I already brought up one example, but it happens throughout the novel. And then Charlie just keeps forgiving her and keeps reconciling with her. And the entire emotional responsibility for their relationship just seems to rest on Charlie's shoulders. And she even says as much at one point. Like, she actually realizes that at one point, that the responsibility for her friendship and for any kind of relationship with Geli rests on her shoulders. So that just made the entire pairing just very hard to root for. Then there is a small interlude of kind of like Charlie and Ingrid, which is, like I said, small but very memorable and very sweet. So Ingrid is Tommy's, the boy, the first boy that Geli hooks up with, Tommy's cousin from Hamburg. So she is part of the swing Jugend there and then visits her cousin in Berlin. The whole scene with her just has very, very strong consent and communication going on there. Charlie goes to another dance hall alone with Geli, so Renate and Minna are no longer going with them. And then she meets Ingrid from Hamburg, and they have this immediate connection. Like, Ingrid is kind of leaning there and just nodding at her, and they immediately kind of understand, like, oh, she's into me. But they do kind of confirm that verbally later on. And they kiss. And it's very cute. But midway through the kiss, Charlie realizes that she wants Ingrid to be somebody else. And then she pulls back and Ingrid asks, bin ich nicht gut? Like, am I not good? Am I not a good kisser? And Charlie tells her, doch, I just wish you were someone else. And Ingrid just immediately goes, tell me about her. So like, just completely understanding there's this like queer connection forming between them immediately, even if it's not completely romantic, because Charlie is still yearning for Geli. But there's just like so much consent going on there and no hard feelings. And it was just like, my note just said, my gay heart. And then, like I said, Charlie then kind of wants to make Geli jealous by kissing Ingrid when they are back in the club so that Geli actually sees. And Ingrid isn't just in on the plan, it was actually her idea. And like, she kind of like takes the lead in that. She like walks up to where Geli is standing with Tommy and some other people, and like puts her arm around Charlie and kind of like plays it up a little bit. So it's using somebody else to make your main love interest jealous, but it happens with so much consent around that. Like, and that is the only acceptable way for this kind of thing to go down, where the other person is fully on board. And like I said, Ingrid is not just fully on board, it's kind of her idea. And Charlie goes along with it, agrees with it, because she does want to make Geli jealous at that point. And then the other main coupling is Charlie and Renate. Like I said, their romance only comes into the picture over halfway through the novel. And like I said, it felt to me a little bit like it came out of left field, but then it develops into something that feels much, much more stable than the thing with the relationship between Geli and Charlie. So obviously they share a lot of things. They share this secrecy, both around listening to swing music, but also around being queer. They share their love for music. They share the whole that they want to resist, that they want to be part of the resistance. Like I said, they hand out these anti-party sentiment postcards together, and they both survive the war. Tiny little bit of a spoiler warning. But like I said, because the whole thing with Geli and Charlie's emotions and feelings for Geli remain unresolved for so long, the whole Charlie Renate pairing kind of gets very emotionally complicated, which again just doesn't bode well for a romance novel, really. I also at times felt that Renate was maybe a little bit too understanding of Charlie's feelings for Geli. Like, there are numerous occasions when Geli kind of just pops back into the picture and Charlie continuously chooses her and kind of leaves Renate behind, in quotes. It's not that she always kind of like communicates that to Renate, and Renate never gets jealous and she remains completely understanding of that. But like, I felt a little bit too understanding. Like, at one point, you're dating the girl who keeps going back to her ex, and at some point I feel like even the most understanding person would get fed up with that. At the end, spoiler, seriously, this is the major spoiler that I was continuously hinting at. At the end, Geli dies. I will talk a little bit more about the circumstances when I go into the full ending section, but Geli dies, and her death makes Renate feel like the one who is left. So even though she is the better choice, she is the healthier choice, I couldn't get rid of the feeling that at the end, Charlie and Renate are together because Geli is literally no longer in the picture. Like, she's literally dead. Okay, so now that we talked about characters and their relationships to each other, let's get a little bit more into the technical stuff and talk about the writing style and the plot and the pacing. Once again, this was a very easy to read book. It was very accessible prose. I kind of noted this in my review of Some Girls Do, and this very much felt along the same lines. It was very easy to read, it was very easy to follow. Like I said, there was a strong sense of period detail, so I very much felt like this was set in World War II Berlin. And also there was a very the author integrated German phrases a lot and very, very well. So like, the author clearly worked very, very hard with the language and tried to learn the language, and I can only say it definitely paid off. Almost on every page, I feel like there was a German phrase, and it was always kind of like stuff that was very typical of the German language. So kind of like Ende der Diskussion, Charlotte, or macht nix, or like expressions like doch, which don't really have an English equivalent. So as a native German speaker, this felt very very true to life, very much like I really like the integration of those German phrases. But and it did make me wonder, how would someone who does not know German and who doesn't understand German, how would they feel about it? I mean, they mostly explain, or there is a translation after or before the German sentence, so I don't think you would get entirely lost. But that's something I can't really make any judgments on, because I did understand every German phrase that was used. I feel like the writing served the story pretty well. Pretty late into the book, Charlie has this thought: when I was growing up, these streets were called something different. When Hitler rose to power, he changed them, changed the street names and then the borders, so the lines on our maps became lies. And then later, when the war is over, this gets picked up again. But Hitler is dead, and the Allies have come in and declared our city theirs, dividing it up like any existing borders don't matter, making liars of our maps once again. And I just thought this was a very interesting parallel between Hitler and the Allies. And not even in the way that they're saying like the Allies are like Hitler, but that it doesn't feel like the end of the war doesn't feel like a neat conclusion for these characters, because they still have to live with the fallout and with the consequences. And I already mentioned the repeated looking away when something uncomfortable happens. It's not subtle, but it was very effective. I guess kind of like coming off of the it was very accessible prose, very easy to follow, it's not especially sophisticated. And I don't mean that as an insult. Like I said, I found it very easy to follow. This became a very easy to read book, but at times it felt like the writing was almost too simple for the weight of the story that was being told. Like it's a story about resistance, it's a story set in World War II Berlin. So it felt like there should be some equivalent in the writing to the story that is being told. And at times I felt like the writing just kind of like flowed along. The German phrase would be the writing plätscherte along. I don't know how to translate plätscherte. I will look that up and maybe put in a note here. And also sometimes the emotional and or political awareness of the main character of Charlie felt a bit too neat early on. So when Greta gets inducted into the Jungmädelbund, there's a speech being given by someone from the party, and it ends with a unified voice for a unified Germany, which, again, very accurate. But then Charlie thinks, except we aren't unified. Not really. If we were, Minna and her sisters would be allowed to join. If we were, Renate wouldn't have to hide her disability. And this is on page 39. So it's very, very early on into the story. And I immediately thought that this is a very astute observation and believable also for her character, given her group of friends. Like she has a Jewish friend, she has a disabled friend. So obviously she would notice that they aren't included in the unified Germany, but it almost feels like that was too early on. I found myself thinking that it might have worked better if this was an understanding that Charlie would have gradually gained throughout the story. Like this could have been part of her character development, but it was just there from the beginning. And I also already mentioned that Charlie can feel very mature for 15, especially at the beginning. Like I said, she gets older, but her maturity level, I felt, almost never changed. Like she did have character growth and character development, but the way she read, the maturity level just kind of felt like it never changed. So the plot and pacing, I thought this book was very well paced. The setup takes a little bit of time, but it feels very much earned. So I wouldn't call it a slow buildup. It takes some time, but it needs to take the time. It's exactly the appropriate amount of time that you need in order to set this story up. I also felt that there was a very good balance between the war story, the resistance story, the friendship, the queer coming of age, and the romantic tension. Like all of these strengths worked very well together to form this one singular story that was being told. And the stakes escalated very, very naturally. So you start with the forbidden music, with them sneaking out at night and going just for fun, just because they like listening to the music. It doesn't really have a political motivator at that point. But then obviously the political tensions ramp up and Reichspogromnacht happens, and that causes Minna to leave. And then the war begins, and we get several air raids and the whole surveillance of the population ramping up. Then Charlie gets a letter from Ingrid saying that a swing meeting in Hamburg was raided. And then at the very end, a dance club in Berlin gets raided. And I feel like all of this, especially like the Berlin raid at the end, was very well foreshadowed. Like, I noted this with Last Night at the Telegraph Club, that I could see this raid of the club happening almost all throughout the story. Like I knew that this was going to be the climax. And again, I don't mean that as a dig or as an insult. I actually feel this was very, very well handled. Like just because I can see it coming doesn't mean it's bad. It just means it's very well foreshadowed. And then, like I said, there is this Heine poetry thread that kind of like weaves through this story. So Geli gives Charlie a book of Heine poems and asks her to remember one. And this then becomes a recurring plot thread. And this development of like how well Charlie is able to memorize the poem kind of mirrors what's going on in their friendship, or how well their friendship is going. And it just kind of like this becomes sort of a motif for their friendship. So at one point, Charlie says to Geli, "Oh, I almost finished memorizing the poem." And Geli goes, "What poem?" And that's just like a really good gut punch, because it's been built up in Charlie's head. Like, she keeps thinking if she can memorize the poem, then she can keep Geli, then she can hold on to her. And just then Geli going, "What poem?" and just completely not remembering what Charlie is talking about. This works very well as this emotional gut punch. It's just kind of like oomph. But I do have critiques a little bit. So there were some setups that felt a little heavy-handed. So there is a Sissy Helene comparison. Charlie tells Greta the story of Sissy, who married Franz Josef, the Emperor of Austria. I think Sissy is a pretty well-known story, but initially Franz Josef was supposed to marry Sissy's sister Helene, and so Charlie compares herself to Helene and Geli to Sissy, who was the most beautiful person that Franz Josef had ever seen, and so he just had to marry her. And this felt a little bit heavy-handed, but also it didn't really go anywhere. So I think the Sissy thing gets sometimes brought up between Charlie and Greta sometimes, but it doesn't. If it felt both very heavy-handed at first, but then it never cropped up again. So I was left a tad confused as to why that was there. And I already mentioned the early political awareness that I kind of just bumped over. That just kind of felt like some threads are introduced but then don't develop as expected. For one thing, this is the case with the Sissy parallel, but then also with like Renate's parents, especially her mother, and the whole party sympathy thing, where I mentioned that she at first seemed sympathetic towards the party and the party ideology, but then she gets very appalled at Fritz's radicalization, and that just kind of seemed a bit sudden because it wasn't really set up that they like, okay, so when did they change their mind, or did they change their mind and they just wanted to follow the party line in order to keep their family safe, because that would have also been a possibility. But I was kind of left not knowing what was the case there. And I also felt that like some side characters were maybe a little bit underused or underutilized. I almost found myself thinking that this is a story that could have benefited from multiple POVs, which is almost funny coming from me, because I am generally skeptical of multiple POV stories. Like, I feel like there has to be a really good justification for it within the narrative. Like, you cannot tell this story without multiple POVs, or it would severely impact the narrative and the story that you're telling, in order for me to go, "Oh yeah, no, that's a good use of multiple POVs." And like for me to then like read a book and go, I think this would have benefited from multiple POVs, is just a little bit funny, a little bit ironic almost. But like, I feel like there could have been like Geli could have gotten some POV chapters, Renate could have gotten some POV chapters, Greta could have gotten some POV chapters, I felt like. So that's not a flaw. I don't mind that it's not a multiple POV book. And again, I probably, if it had been a multiple POV book, I would have been almost skeptical and gone like, was this really necessary? But it's just, I just feel it's an interesting missed opportunity here. Okay, big spoilers are coming up. We're going to talk about the ending. So let's go through what happens first before we dive into my feelings on it. So we have this final Tanzabend, this final dance with Geli at the same location as the first one in chapter one. So, like, again, very neat circular structure here. And both Charlie and Geli confess their love to each other. They say even multiple times, "Ich liebe dich," I love you. But Charlie herself distinguishes that she loves Geli, but she is no longer in love with her. Again, very good character development, character growth, and also emotional awareness of the character. Like, oh yeah, I love her, but I am no longer in love with her. So even before that, Fritz, Renate's younger brother, overhears their plan to meet at this Tanzpalast. So he snitches on them and the Tanzpalast gets raided. Greta is also there. She kind of like suspected that Charlie was going to go out. So she followed her. Like I said, she gets very indignant that Charlie keeps her from all of this. So she sneaks out after Charlie and follows her to this Tanzpalast. Kind of like just before the Nazi officers raid this establishment, she kind of like sees Greta out of the corner of her eye and so knows that Greta is there. And so she leaves Geli behind in order to save Charlie. And like I said, this is like some major character development that Charlie no longer simply follows Geli around, but makes her own choices and chooses her sister over this person that she may love, but that she is no longer in love with. That kind of has no longer has this emotionally intense position in her life. So Charlie and Greta escape, but Geli gets captured, and there is a public punishment for everyone who was captured at this Tanzpalast. So Geli and the other boys from the Swing Jugend get their long hair cut off by SS officers. All of the boys in the Swing Jugend wear long hair, kind of also as a small act of protest, because boys were supposed to have short hair and girls were supposed to grow their hair long. So they cut all of their hair off and kind of like subject them to public humiliation. Geli's own father is there and kind of like administers the punishment, or like, you know, he kind of instructs Fritz to do the actual punishment, but he is there. And he calls his own daughter a hure, a whore. It's intense. But again, it felt very realistic to what would have been going on. And this is kind of like the moment where Charlie forces herself to look. Like, she wants to look away. She has this thought of like that this is very uncomfortable. And I mean, it's supposed to be, but she forces herself to look. Among other things, because Renate isn't looking away either. So you kind of get this sense that Renate gives her the strength to also not look away, which again kind of like suggests that they have this very mutually supportive relationship. Like, and later it is revealed that Geli and the other members of the Swing Jugend get sent to concentration camps, and Geli does not return. So it's never said in as many words, but Geli is dead. Geli dies in that concentration camp. Like I said, it's not literally spelled out, but Charlie says, "It is the last time I see Angelika Haas alive." So she never sees her again, and the implication is very much that Geli died in that concentration camp. But Charlie and Renate survive. Their families survive, but damaged. So Renate's father gets killed in a bombing, and Renate's mother falls into a very deep depression. And Charlie's family's home gets destroyed in a bombing, so they move in with Renate's family in order to help and support them. Then, towards the end of the war, the Soviets invade. Again, this was a very impactful sentence for me. "We hide ourselves in the cellar because we know what they do to women they find." And again, it's not spelled out, but you know exactly what they mean. And just this highlights the realities of war. And again, this like, it's not a neat conclusion, even though it's probably historically the better outcome that the Nazi regime got defeated, but the Allies weren't kind. Berlin is in ruins. Again, very historically accurate. Berlin was very much bombed to complete destruction. That Minna's fate remains unknown. It is hinted that Charlie and Greta might go to Paris and try to find her, but there's also the sentence where Charlie says, "We might have to go a lot further than Paris." Yeah, the end of the war is just not a neat conclusion. There is occupation, there's a divided city, there's this line of like maps becoming lies again. There are fates that remain unknown. This is a very bittersweet ending, but like I said, it's realistic, and it did leave an impact on me. It wasn't quite as devastating as I thought it would be. So I think this might have to do with the fact that my expectations were set a little high. So on the cover of the book, there is a quote from Melinda Lowe, who is the author of Last Night at the Telegraph Club, the second book I reviewed in this series. And it reads, "A heartbreaking and bittersweet novel about the need for queer joy, even in the midst of the horrors of war. The ending had me in tears." And Melinda Lowe's novels ending also had me in tears. So I was expecting it to be more devastating than it ended up being for me. It was still impactful, it was still bittersweet, and it was still realistic. It didn't wreck me as much as the ending for Last Night at the Telegraph Club did. Also, Geli's death makes complete sense thematically. Like, it underlines this point of privilege ultimately cannot save you, and being an SS officer's daughter does not protect her once she violates the system. So it makes complete sense thematically that she had to die for the narrative. But I dislike what it does to the story structurally, because it removes Charlie's choice. So, like I already said, Renate becomes the one who is left. She is basically the only option that Charlie is left with. And in my opinion, this just makes this less satisfying than if Charlie had actively chosen Renate while Geli is still alive. Let's talk about my final verdict of the story. So I haven't, at the time of recording, officially given it a rating on Goodreads because I didn't know what to rate it as. I think I'm hovering between 3.5 and 4 out of 5 stars. I overall really enjoyed this book. My critiques just aren't minor things. So my biggest critique, obviously, and I've mentioned this repeatedly, is that the romance is very hard to root for. Both the romance between Charlie and Geli, because of the slightly toxic relationship dynamic, and the relationship between Charlie and Renate, because it comes into play so late into the story, and that kind of like makes the whole thing just a little bit muddy. And the ending just weakens Charlie's agency for me. I explained that in just the last section. And then the slightly minor thing is that the prose is possibly a little bit too simple for the subject matter. But I wouldn't deduct a star for that. It's just something I noted, but it isn't a major critique or anything. But obviously, I found the historical setting very, very compelling. Like I said, I think the author put a ton of research into this book, both for the historical aspects and for the language aspects. And I can just tip my head to Nita Tyndall. I feel like they've done a very, very good job with both of these. And also, like, the pacing was very good. The themes were very well integrated into the story, especially the book's main theme of kind of like resistance in small acts of defiance. And sometimes the world is just too large and too big for you to do the big things, but that doesn't mean the small things aren't worth doing. The ending was effective. Like I said, it did still leave an impact on me, even if I find it slightly imperfect. So overall, this is a compelling World War II coming of age story about queer identity and small acts of resistance, but a romance that left me emotionally conflicted. It's a strong recommend for the right reader, but I would probably say that it's not a new favorite of mine, which, again, not really a critique or not really a flaw of the book. It's just I probably wasn't the right reader, which did surprise me because I found the premise and the setting very, very intriguing. So overall, I think I'm landing somewhere between a 3.5 and 4-star rating. All right, so since this is my final review of the Sapphic book review series, I thought we could do a quick overview of all 4 of them. If you have been following along, my least favorite will certainly not be a surprise for you. So on the 4th spot lands One Last Stop. It is easily my least favorite of the bunch. Again, it has a compelling premise. The time travel element was very well executed, and it was kind of like the thing that drew me in, but it's just such a flawed execution. The decisions that were made for the characters just did not make sense to me, and I just hated the prioritization of the romance genre conventions over character development, which left me very, very frustrated with this book. So easily my least favorite book and the last spot. And for number 3 and number 4, I debated a little bit. This wasn't as clear cut as number 4 and number 1, but I did end up putting Nothing Sung and Nothing Spoken on the third spot in this list. It has a strong premise again, and the World War II Berlin setting was very relatable. Relatable was very like I found myself easy to put myself in that setting. It has strong characters and character arcs. It is very well researched. There is the exploration of the small acts of resistance is very strong, but just the romance was just so difficult to root for. And in a romance novel, that just doesn't bode well. Geli is frustrating in a way that weakens the romantic investment for me. Like I said, I just couldn't see them lasting. I noted at the beginning that I found their toxic dynamic slightly interesting, but it never got past that. And then because we never got past that, the Renate felt kind of like felt like she fell flat as an option. Also, it develops like a little bit too suddenly, and Geli's death removes Charlie's agency, which I just didn't like, and the writing just felt a little bit too simple for the weight of the story. So those critiques do weigh it down a lot, which is why it ultimately landed on the number 3 spot for me. Then on the number 2 spot, we have Some Girls Do by Jennifer Dugan. So this book had a very strong sense of the characters. I could immediately relate to those characters. I could immediately gather who they are as people. It's a good use of the dual POV. I mentioned that I'm slightly skeptical of multiple POV stories, but I think this was a very good use of dual POV. It's a light romance with some darker / heavier elements woven in, like, for example, parental abuse. It has very good LGBTQ representation, again, very easy to read with a satisfying conclusion. The main characters do end up together and seem like a good fit for now. But I do have some critiques, which is why it's not the number 1 spot. So the activism through line is slightly over the top, borderline annoying at times. The pacing drags a little, especially in the middle. So there was a lot of build up, a lot of will they, won't they, and then not enough time with the leads as a couple before everything goes downhill, as is typical for a YA romance plot. This is, and like I said, is a very easy read, so I don't feel like you're investing that much energy into it, but you get a lot out of it, which is ultimately why I decided to rank it higher than Nothing Sung and Nothing Spoken. And now for the number 1 spot, which you can all guess because there's only one left. It is Last Night at the Telegraph Club. I think this is a very good case in point for how being able to root for the main couple is gonna take a reader throughout your entire book. Those are easily the most compatible love interests. Pretty much from the first time they hang out together, I could instantly tell that they both have chemistry and compatibility, which is kind of like one of my main critiques. Was one of my main critiques for Some Girls Do, that I could see the chemistry but not the compatibility. These two are instantly compatible, so they are easily the most easy to root for couple. There has a strong thematic through line with the Telegraph Club and the queer history and the queer identity. It's a deeply relatable coming of age story, a rich exploration of queer history and lesbian community in 1950s San Francisco. But even though it's set in the 1950s, it was instantly relatable to me. My strongest critique of this book is that I desperately wished for a less bleak and more hopeful ending, but I think the ending does serve the story very, very well. And it is one of the reasons why this book has stuck with me in the way that it did. But this becomes more like it's critique, it's praise disguised as critique. I think the author did such a good job writing a compelling story that by the end I was wishing for a happier ending, but I also understand why, given the circumstances, the characters don't get that happy ending. So this was easily my favorite of the bunch. So yeah, this has been my Sapphic book review for this year's Pride Month. If you've read any of these, I'm curious as to how you'd rate these books. So drop a comment down below and subscribe to my channel if you'd like to see more of my content. But for now, this is me signing off. Thanks everyone for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please make sure to like, share, and comment down below. And don't forget to hit subscribe if you don't want to miss any of my future videos. I also have a Patreon that you can subscribe to, starting at as little as $2 a month, which gives you early access to any of my videos. Higher tiers include access to exclusive Patreon-only content and the chance to suggest books, plays, or poems for any future analysis. For now, that is it from me, and I'll see you next time.